I only needed shelter, but that iron hook was hiding someone's unfinished legacy.
Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Wren Ellison had been braiding her whole life without knowing it. As a child outside Georgetown, she plaited creek grass while waiting for the school bus and twisted grocery twine around broken gate latches. Her hands disliked loose ends. At 9, she could mend a halter with baling cord tightly enough that rain could not work the knot free. No one praised this. The farm simply kept using what she repaired. Her mother died when Wren was 6, leaving one blue enamel cup and a photograph curled at the corners. Her father, Edwin, answered hard moments by lowering his eyes. He worked long shifts at a feed mill and came home with flour dust in his face, too tired or afraid to oppose the strongest voice in the kitchen. The one person who noticed Wren's hands was her grandfather, Silas Ellison, a leather braider with a narrow shop near Paris, Kentucky. Every Saturday he warmed a lum-tanned cowhide beside the stove, then let her draw a strand cutter through it while he held the tension. He taught her to bevel each edge so 12 strands settled without ridges, grease them with tallow, and pull a spiral plait firm enough to sing against the bench. They ate biscuits over the scrap bin. Then he fixed a fiberglass or horn core into the wall hook and made her begin again whenever daylight showed between strands. He tapped the flaw with one square fingernail and waited. "A braid tells the truth about every pull," Silas said. He meant that one careless strand could hide for inches, but never forever. Pressure would find it, and the whole length would turn around the mistake. Silas died of a stroke in February 2019. Before Wren could reach the shop, an estate crew had emptied it into a truck. Cutters, awls, silver ferrules, braiding hooks, bundles of hide, even the horn cores marked in his pencil. Her father said the debts required it. Wren kept only a narrow scrap of black leather she found beneath the stove, still bearing the shallow half-moons of Silas's thumbnail. By then, Edwin had married Marla, a woman who closed cabinets without sound and knew how much sugar remained in the jar. She kept cash in labeled envelopes and counted it each Sunday, wetting one finger before every bill. Nothing escaped her inventory, including Wren's hours and meals. She did not strike or shout. She moved Wren's belongings, corrected small memories before Edwin, and asked mild questions whose answers had already been judged. On November 3rd, 2022, Wren came home to find her canvas satchel on the porch and a grocery envelope lying open beside it. 320s had been tucked beneath her mattress. Marla stood in the doorway, holding the empty envelope by one corner, her face composed as folded linen. "You stole it. Leave before your father returns." 8 words, delivered without heat. Edwin was already there. Wren saw his work boots behind Marla, toes turned toward the wall. He did not step forward. On the porch rail sat her mother's blue enamel cup, placed upside down as though it had been washed and put away. Wren lifted it, then left it there. Marla's silence followed her down the gravel drive, not triumphant, merely certain. Her father never called her name. For 6 weeks, Wren moved by cheap buses, borrowed rides, and walking. In Frankfurt, she slept behind a laundromat where dryer vents breathed warm lint into the alley. In Versailles, she curled beneath an empty fairground grandstand until a groundskeeper pointed her toward the road. She spent $1.19 on crackers, then 68 cents on a bruised apple. Near Nicholasville, rain soaked her shoes while she slept in a church vestibule, waking whenever the security light clicked on. Her money thinned from $23 to $14, then $9. She washed in library restrooms and dried her socks beneath hand blowers. The $7 in her boot remained untouched. It had come from Silas on her last birthday with him, folded around a note that said, "For a tool, not a treat." She had spent the other bills over the years, but not those 7. By mid-December, they were the only money she possessed. Hunger made them feel heavier, not easier to use. On December 16th, in the Lexington Public Library on East Main Street, she opened a county surplus circular because the radiator beside her chair had gone cold. Most listings were machinery, drainage easements, and parcels priced beyond meaning. At the bottom of a stained page, one line had been boxed in pencil. Abandoned craft studio, Old Frankfort Pike vicinity. Structure as is, sealed bid. Minimum, $7. The demolition notice beneath it was dated for March. Wren read the listing 3 times. Then she copied the parcel number onto the back of Silas's note, asked the librarian for a bus schedule, and walked to the county clerk's office before the light left the windows. She did not know whether the building could shelter her, only that $7 had finally found the shape of a tool. By dusk, Wren was traveling toward a door. The county had already decided no one would open again. The bus carried Wren west beneath a sky the color of old tin, past horse farms where black fences climbed and fell with the land. She rode as far as the driver would take her for $2, then walked 9 miles along Old Frankfort Pike with the satchel cutting into one shoulder. Darkness found her beside a hay barn near Viley Road. The loft smelled of clover, mice, and cold iron. At 27 degrees, she slept inside a hollow between bales, waking whenever wind worried the loose roofing. By morning, her hair held pieces of straw. She shook them free and followed the road toward a small settlement gathered around a crossing. Merrick's Feed and Seed, Bluegrass Cafe, Halley Hardware, a barber shop called the Brass Rail, and Pruitt's Used Books, whose front window displayed 3 faded racing programs and a lamp without a shade. Delivery trucks moved slowly there. Men in work coats lifted 2 fingers from steering wheels as they passed. The county clerk's annex occupied a square brick building behind the courthouse in Lexington. Wren entered shortly after noon, her wet shoes leaving dark prints across the terrazzo floor. A brass clock ticked above rows of deed books, and somewhere beyond the counter, a machine struck paper with a flat mechanical cough. The woman behind the property desk wore a silver hearing aid shaped like a comma. Her nameplate read, Mrs. Eleanor Vale. She looked at Wren, then at the canvas satchel, then slid the surplus property notice beneath the glass divider. You understand the building has no electricity. Yes, ma'am. You understand the well has not been tested. Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will make no repairs. Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition becomes your responsibility once this transfers. Wren placed the 7 folded dollars on the counter. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Vale did not reach for them immediately. She studied the bills, especially the oldest one, whose center crease had softened almost white. Then she drew a deed from the brown folder and turned it so the signature line faced Wren. The document described one stone and timber workshop, approximately 680 square feet, with a detached privy, shallow well, and disputed eastern boundary. Wren signed carefully. The clerk pressed a brass seal into a black ink pad and brought it down with both hands. The stamp landed hard enough to tremble through the counter. Old Frankfort Pike to Viley, Mrs. Vale said, past the limestone gate with the broken capstone. Take the gravel lane north until it forks at 2 black walnuts. Keep left. The place is behind the second rise. She opened the cash drawer but paused with the $7 in her hand. Ellison, she said. That was your grandfather's name. Wren looked up. Mrs. Vale removed her glasses and cleaned one lens with the edge of her sleeve. He filed trade permits here. Crop shafts, braided keepers, silver-mounted handles. He came every January, even after the large saddleries stopped ordering local work. Wren kept one palm on the deed, so the paper would not shake. The studio belonged to Adelaide Bell, the clerk continued. Your grandfather apprenticed there when he was young. I remember him carrying boxes up those steps. He had a burn mark along his left wrist. It was a mark Wren knew. Pale skin shaped like a narrow leaf, made when a pot of heated tallow overturned before she was born. Mrs. Vale looked again at the worn dollar. He tried to purchase the parcel once. The title was tangled between heirs, and then the taxes carried it away from all of them. Why did no one tell me? The clerk placed the deed in an envelope. County records tell what happened. They rarely tell why people kept quiet. She set $6 into the drawer. The seventh she flattened beneath the glass top of her desk, beside an old photograph of the courthouse. For the record, she said, the county has received payment. Wren walked back toward the outskirts, carrying the envelope inside her shirt to keep it dry. The afternoon had warmed enough to soften the road shoulders, where limestone mud clung to her soles. At the broken gate she met an elderly man repairing wire with yellow gloves. His red hound stood beside him, one ear folded inward. You looking for Bell's place? He asked. Wren nodded. The man pointed with his fencing pliers. Left at the walnuts. Dog'll bark, but he's too lazy to follow. The hound watched her pass, gave one doubtful sound, and lay down again. Beyond the fork, the lane narrowed between trees whose black branches knitted overhead. Walnut husks, dark and collapsed, pressed into the mud. Wren climbed the second rise and saw the studio sitting low against the winter field. Its front half was built of hand-shaped limestone, the rear of weathered poplar boards gone silver with age. The building measured perhaps 34 feet long and 20 feet across. A rusted standing seam roof sagged near the chimney, where 3 courses of brick had begun to spill outward. Above the door hung a cedar sign, its paint reduced to shadows. Bell and Ellison, fine crops and braided leather. Wren stopped beneath it. The second name was faint, but it was there. She fitted the county key into the lock. It resisted until she leaned her shoulder against the door, then turned with a dry internal snap. The bottom rail dragged across the floor, pushing a ridge of grit ahead of it. Cold air came out first, carrying the sour mineral smell of alum-tanned hide left too long in dampness. The front room held a narrow counter, 2 stools, and a cast-iron stove whose pipe had separated from the chimney thimble. Dust softened every edge. When Wren stepped inside, a floorboard complained beneath her heel, and something small moved behind the wall. She touched the counter. The wood felt waxy, almost greasy, where generations of hands had rested. A cracked glass jar still contained brass rivets gone green at their edges. She lifted one and tasted metal in the air when the pieces shifted against each other. The back room was darker. Hundreds of leather strands hung from ceiling rails, some twisted like dry vines, others broken and scattered over the floor. Fiberglass shafts rolled beneath a bench. Horn cores lay split lengthwise, their interiors pale as old teeth. On the far wall, a cast-iron braiding hook projected from a mounting plate thick with rust. It was larger than the one she remembered from childhood, with a curved jaw designed to hold a dozen strands under punishing tension. Wren laid her fingers on it. The iron was so cold that her skin clung for an instant. She found the well behind the building and lowered its bucket, but the water came up clouded, smelling faintly of leaves. She did not drink it. Instead, she ate the last crackers from her satchel and collected fallen walnut branches until twilight erased the fence lines. The stove could not yet be trusted, so she made no fire. She swept a place beside the front counter with a broken broom, spread her coat over the boards, and placed the deed beneath her head. Through the roof holes she could see 3 stars. Rainwater, trapped somewhere inside the wall, released one slow drop every few minutes. Before sleep, Wren heard the leather strips stirring in a draft from the back room. Their dry ends touched one another with a faint, deliberate sound, like hands beginning work in darkness. Pain is only a loose strand until patience braids it into strength. On the first morning, Wren tied a strip of cloth around the well bucket and lowered it until the rope went slack. She drew the water 3 times, emptied each load onto the frozen grass, then carried the 4th inside to settle in a glass jar. By afternoon, the cloudiness had sunk to the bottom, but she still boiled every cup. The outhouse leaned east and admitted daylight through its boards. She wedged the door with limestone and learned to step over the second plank, which moved under weight. The studio had its own language. The front floor creaked sharply near the stove, sighed beside the counter, and remained silent along the north wall. At night she followed those sounds without lighting a match. By the 3rd day, she could cross from the door to her blanket in darkness without waking the mice. She returned to the settlement carrying the detached stovepipe beneath one arm. Halley Hardware occupied a deep room with pressed tin ceilings and bins that smelled of cedar shavings, rope, and machine oil. Its owner, Mr. Otis Halley, had one white eyebrow and one brown, which gave him the permanent expression of a man considering 2 answers at once. He turned the pipe in his hands. This did not come loose yesterday. "No, sir. Chimney swept? Not yet. Then you do not light it." Wren placed her remaining coins on the counter. Mr. Halley counted them, pushed 2 back, and opened a ledger whose pages had been ruled by hand. "I can give you a 30-day account," he said. "Not because the building is worth anything. Because Eleanor Vale called and said you answered every warning without blinking. I can work it off. You can pay when you can. Work is separate," he wrote. "Wren Ellison," at the top of a clean page, then gave her a stained paperback titled "Repairs for Rural Homes." The cover had been taped twice. "My brother used that book until he knew enough to ignore it," he said. "You should read the chimney chapter before you earn the same privilege." She bought a 6-inch wire flue brush for $8.40, 30 feet of braided rope for $3.10, 2 stovepipe screws for 18 cents each, a pound of furnace cement for $2.75, and a box of long kitchen matches for 49 cents. Mr. Halley added a pair of cracked leather gloves without entering them in the ledger. Back at the studio, Wren read the chimney chapter beside the window, tracing each diagram with one cold finger. The roof was unsafe, so she worked from below. She removed the stovepipe, sealed the firebox opening with damp sacking, and tied the brush between 2 lengths of rope. To the upper end, she fastened a small iron wrench for weight. Then she climbed a ladder into the attic and fed the line through a gap beside the chimney until the wrench dropped into the flue. The first pull brought down nothing. The second released a soft black fall. By the 5th, creosote struck the sacking in hard flakes, some glossy as broken pottery. She pulled the brush up and down in measured strokes, rotating the rope a 1/4 turn each time so the wire reached the corners of the rectangular flue. Twice it jammed at the offset above the thimble. Twice she eased it free rather than forcing it. She worked 5 hours that day and 4 the next. Soot entered the seams of her gloves, her sleeves, the lines around her mouth. When the brush finally rose, without resistance, and a mirror held inside the thimble showed a clean thread of daylight, she sat on the floor and listened to her own breathing. She patched the stovepipe joint with furnace cement, drove in the 2 screws, and waited overnight. The first fire was no larger than her hand. She began with dry walnut twigs, then added 1 split piece of poplar. Smoke curled inside the stove, hesitated, and rose cleanly into the pipe. The iron gave a small ticking sound as it warmed. Wren held her palms near the door, but did not touch it. For supper, she boiled well water in a dented tin cup and stirred in cornmeal. Mr. Halley had wrapped in brown paper. She ate the porridge with a rivet spoon she found beneath the counter, its bowl blackened but sound. Heat moved slowly into the room, uncovering smells hidden by the cold. Leather, old ash, damp limestone, and the faint sweetness of tallow. On the fourth day, she began the workroom inventory. She found a strand cutter with 3 replaceable blades, each furred with rust, but still seated true. Beneath a bench lay a lignum vitae burnisher, polished dark by hands. A silver ferrule, unfinished and dented, rested in a drawer beside a bundle of waxed linen thread. There were 2 horn cores, one cracked beyond use and one flexible when she tested it gently against her palm. A narrow plaiting fid had been driven point first into the wall. 6 brass-maker's stamps spelled letters she could not yet arrange. The hanging leather was mostly ruined. When she bent one strand, it snapped and released a stale, sour odor. Still, a roll wrapped in oilcloth remained supple at its center. She cut away the outer inch and found pale, alum-tanned hide beneath, dry but not dead. The cast-iron braiding hook on the far wall held her longest. Its mounting plate was fixed with 4 square-headed bolts, each painted over many times. The hook itself curved outward at chest height, ending in a jaw with a leather-lined clamp. Wren cleaned it with a rag and a little kerosene from the lamp tin. Beneath the grime, the iron showed casting marks and a faint seam around the base. She tapped the plate with the wooden handle of the plaiting fid. The upper half answered with a dense iron note. The lower half sounded dull. She tapped again, moving 1 inch at a time. Near the center came a third sound, quieter and hollow, as though the metal enclosed a room no larger than her fist. Wren pressed her shoulder against the hook. It did not move. She tried lifting it and felt weight concentrated oddly toward the wall, heavier than a solid casting of that size should have been. The seam at the base continued behind a collar of blackened leather. She cut no leather that day. Instead, she softened the collar with warm water, working drop by drop so it would not tear. The leather had been smoked nearly black and stitched with thread finer than any saddle seam. Under it lay a cedar disc fitted flush into the iron core. A shallow notch marked one edge. Wren inserted the plaiting fid and turned. Nothing. She warmed the iron with cloths dipped in hot water, dried it, then tried again. The disc shifted less than a quarter inch and released a breath of air smelling of cedar, metal, and something faintly medicinal. She stopped until her hand steadied. The cedar plug came free on the third attempt. Inside the hollow core, packages had been pushed one behind another and wrapped against damp. Wren drew out the first with 2 fingers. It was a roll of waxed cloth tied in red thread. The second was narrower, bound in braided rawhide. The third was a rectangular tin box whose sides scraped softly against the iron. She carried everything to the front counter before opening any of it. The waxed cloth contained tools, a small French-edged skiving knife, and awl with a rosewood haft, 2 silver gauges, and a plaiting hook cast from a metal, too pale and heavy to be steel. She rubbed its curve with her thumb. Even under tarnish, it held a cold white shine. Platinum, though Wren did not yet trust herself to say the word aloud. The rawhide packet held folded diagrams drawn in brown ink. 12-strand and 16-strand patterns crossed the pages in exact over and under paths. One sheet showed a Turk's head knot built in 7 bites and 5 leads, with corrections written beside each turn. Tighten from the standing end. Dress twice. Never pull across the grain. The notes were practical, severe, and familiar in their patience. She opened the tin box last. Inside lay bundles of currency wrapped in oil paper, a buckskin pouch, and a sealed envelope. She placed the envelope aside without reading the name written across it. Then she counted the money once, lost her place, and began again. There were $1 silver certificates, worn $10 Federal Reserve notes, and several 50s printed before she was born. The buckskin pouch held Morgan silver dollars, buffalo nickels, Indian head cents, and 4 half-dollars darkened at their rims. At the bottom lay a purple heart in a small cardboard case. The inscription on the reverse named Thomas Bell, 1944. Wren wrote each subtotal in the margin of the repair manual. Bills, $21,680. Coins at marked face value, $420. A final roll, tucked beneath the metal case, held no band and no label. It contained $20 notes totaling exactly $1,000. She added everything 3 times, $22,100. The figure did not become more believable when written. Wren placed both hands flat on the counter. The studio remained unchanged around her. Wind still entered beneath the door. The roof still leaked. One mouse still worked at something behind the north wall. She returned the metal to its case and set the platinum hook beside it. She arranged the currency into the tin box exactly as she had found it, then lifted the envelope. The handwriting on the front stopped her. It leaned slightly to the right, each capital formed with a narrow upper loop. She had seen the same hand on old workshop labels in Silas's shop, though she could not yet place the name. Outside, the afternoon had turned silver. Wren carried the unopened envelope behind the studio and followed a narrow path to a pond below the walnut trees. The surface held a skin of ice, except where water entered through reeds. She sat on a limestone ledge until darkness removed the far bank. She did not open the letter. Not yet. Behind her, the cast iron hook stood empty for the first time in more than half a century. Pain is only a loose strand until patience braids it into strength. At first light, Wren set the envelope beside the stove and waited for the room to warm. Moisture had lifted one corner of the seal, but the paper remained intact. When she turned it over, the slant of the capitals became clear. Adelaide Bell had labeled Silas's oldest tools in that same hand. Wren had seen it on AW boxes and hide bundles before the estate truck carried them away. She opened the envelope with the tip of the skiving knife. My dear one, whoever you are, if you are reading this, then you have found the hollow in the wall hook, which means either the building has outlived me or someone patient enough to listen to iron has entered it. I hope it is the second. Dr. Miriam Holt at St. Joseph Hospital in Lexington told me in March that the cancer had reached my liver. She gave me months, perhaps less, and advised me to put my affairs in order. I have done so badly in every place except this room, where order has always depended upon the hand. The Bell trade began with Amos Bell, born in 1836 near Harrodsburg, who braided army reins after returning from the Civil War. His daughter Ruth Bell carried the work to Lexington in 1889 and taught her daughter Clara, who opened this shop in 1901. Clara taught me Adelaide Ruth Bell, born in 1878, and I taught Silas Ellison when he came here as a boy in 1936 with more attention than confidence. 4 generations worked these benches before the last order left on September 14, 1968. Since then, the hook has held silence for more than 30 years. My husband, Thomas Bell, died in France in 1944 during the Second World War. The medal with this letter was returned to me with his effects. Our son had died as an infant, and there was no one left to inherit either his name or my shop. I learned then that blood is only one way work travels. The papers contain the knot Silas never quite mastered. Cut the hide while it is cool, between 55 and 65 degrees, or the edge will draw unevenly. For dressing grease, use 2 parts tallow to 1 part beeswax, and warm it only until both turn clear. After beveling, rest 12 strands beneath a damp cloth for 20 minutes. On a Turk's head, tighten in 3 circuits, never 1, and allow the finished knot to dry for 48 hours before polishing. A rushed knot remembers every insult. The money is not a prize. It is years of repairs refused, meals made smaller, and payments from riders who trusted my hands. Spend only what allows the work to continue. Keep the rest for the person who comes after you. The platinum hook belonged to Clara. Use it for fine plaiting, not display. The diagrams are incomplete unless you practice them until your fingers understand what the ink cannot say. Behind the shop, beyond the back door, you will find a limestone marker near the pond. Thomas placed it there when our son died. Please light the blue glass lamp once for them, and once for all, the hands whose names were never stamped into silver. Inheritance is not possession. It is the willingness to keep a tool sharp, return a borrowed kindness, and leave the bench ready for another pair of hands. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Adelaide Ruth Bell, October 11th, 1999. Wren read the letter without moving except to turn the pages. Then she read it again. On the second reading, she placed one fingertip beneath each instruction as Silas had once done with her. When she finished, she folded the sheets along their original creases and returned them to the envelope, smoothing the flap without resealing it. The back door had swollen in its frame. She worked it loose with the awl and stepped into wet grass, silvered by frost. Beyond the walnut trees, near the pond's northern edge, stood a limestone marker, no higher than her knee. Lichen obscured most of the carving. Wren cleared it with her glove and uncovered two names, Thomas A. Bell and Samuel Bell. Beneath them, someone had cut a small, braided circle into the stone. She found the blue glass lamp on a shelf above the workbench, black with soot and wrapped in newspaper dated 1971. The wick had hardened, but a fresh length remained coiled inside its base. Wren trimmed it square, filled the reservoir with a little kerosene, and touched a match to the cloth. Blue glass gathered the flame and made it seem deeper than fire. She carried the lamp outside and set it before the marker. The wind bent the flame, but did not put it out. Standing there, Wren remembered the people whose names had entered her days without demand. Mrs. Vale had kept one worn dollar beneath her desk glass. Otis Halley had opened a credit ledger when she owned nothing but a deed. The hay barn farmer had left the loft unlatched on a freezing night, whether by care or habit. A librarian on East Main Street had found a bus schedule and pressed 2 peppermints into Wren's palm without asking why she needed them. None of those acts had repaired the whole of anything. They had simply held one strand until she could take the tension again. Before the story moves forward, think of one small kindness that reached you when you were too tired, frightened, or proud to ask. Who offered it, and what ordinary thing did they place in your hands? Tell us in the comments if you are willing. Sometimes a cup, a ride, or an unlocked door becomes part of a life long after the giver has forgotten. That night, Wren put the tin box beneath the counter and laid the diagrams, platinum hook, metal, and Adelaide's letter beside her blanket. The blue lamp burned low on the stove. She slept facing the workroom, one hand resting near the folded pages. Snow arrived on December 3rd, 6 inches laid evenly over the fields and badly over the broken roof. Wren read the roofing chapter 3 times beside the stove, then measured the building from the attic and again from the ground. 2 slopes, each 34 by 12 feet, required 9 squares of cedar shingles with waste, 3 rolls of felt, and 16 pounds of galvanized nails. Otis Halley delivered the materials in his truck and handed her a roofing hatchet with a worn leather grip. "My brother's," he said. "He won't need it." The man who followed him up the lane was Asa Pritchard, 71, a former roofer whose left knee bent reluctantly and whose cap bore the faded name of a union local. He looked at the roof, then at Wren. "I cannot pay much," she said. Good, Asa answered. I am not selling. They worked 11 days. First, they braced the weakened west rafter with a sister rafter bolted through soundwood. Then Asa snapped a chalk line across the felt and taught Wren to set each shingle by eye only after the line had given her something honest to measure from. He drove nails in 3 strokes: set, sink, finish. On the second morning, he tapped one of hers. That nail's proud. Wren reached for the hatchet. Pull it. By noon, her shoulders burned. Resin stuck to her gloves, and meltwater ran from the roof edge into her sleeves. Asa never hurried her, though he removed every split shingle she tried to save. On December 15th, Wren fixed the final ridge cap beneath a sky hard and blue. That night, snow fell again, and not one flake entered the attic. January exposed the chimney's deeper injuries. Several bricks had spalled until their faces could be rubbed into red powder, and the mortar between them fell away beneath the point of Wren's trowel. She dismantled the damaged courses 1 brick at a time, numbering each salvageable piece in chalk. Otis helped her find matching soft-fired brick from a collapsed smokehouse. For the joints, she mixed 2 parts hydraulic lime with 1 part washed sand, then added fire clay in equal measure to the lime, where the flue ran hottest. The work lasted 3 weeks in temperatures that remained mostly in the 20s. Bare hands gave her better control, but every 15 minutes her fingers went numb. She warmed them around the blue glass lamp, flexed each joint, and returned to the scaffold. Some mornings, the fresh mortar froze at the edge before she could tool it. She learned to hang canvas around the chimney and keep a small charcoal pan below, never close enough to dry the joints too quickly. The new courses rose slowly, true to a plumb line weighted with an old brass rivet. On January 29th, she built a test fire with dry walnut and 1 piece of oak. Smoke entered the repaired throat, climbed without hesitation, and left the chimney in a narrow gray column. Wren stood outside until the last ember dimmed, watching the clean draw as if it were a promise made without words. The floorboards were white pine, fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails blackened by age. Wren drove each nail below the surface with a square punch, then rented a random orbit sander from Halley Hardware for $14 a day. She made 3 passes. 80 grit removed soot, paint, and the roughest ridges. 120 softened the first scars. 220 left the board smooth enough to catch light without losing the small waves planed into them by hand. Dust filled the room so completely that she could taste pine through the cloth over her mouth. She emptied the sander bag outdoors and swept between every pass. At the north wall, she stopped before erasing a shallow crescent, worn into the floor, beneath the braiding hook. Generations of heels had made it. She sanded around it. The first coat of oil disappeared into the planks at once. The second remained long enough to shine. After the third, she closed the door and allowed a 48-hour cure. The board shifted from dull gray and dark honey toward a mahogany depth that had been hidden beneath decades of dirt. One morning, before the final coat, Wren carried the brush to the door and could not lift it. She walked instead to the marsh beyond the pond. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, motionless except for the wind moving the feathers along its back. She remained there until afternoon and did no work that day. The next morning, the brush moved easily. 8 windows remained. 3 had no glass, 4 were cracked, and 1 held a pane poured in 1788. Its surface rippled enough to bend the walnut trees into wavering columns. Wren preserved that pane exactly as it was. She removed the others by softening old putty with linseed oil and lifting the glazing points with the tip of an awl. New glass came from a salvage yard outside Versailles, cut slightly undersize so winter swelling would not press it against the sash. For each pane, she rolled DAP 33 glazing putty between her palms until it warmed, pressed a bedding bead into the rabbet, seated the glass, and drove points every 8 inches. She laid the finished putty with a knife held at a low angle, drawing each bevel clean enough to shed rain. The sash cords had rotted inside the pockets. Wren replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, feeding each length over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot before lowering the iron counterweight into darkness. The restored windows rose with a soft, balanced resistance and stayed wherever she left them. On the last window, she was trimming putty from the lower rail when a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside. It tipped its black cap toward the glass, struck the branch once with its feet, and remained there, while Wren set the final point. She did not move until the bird had gone. Behind the loose plaster, Wren found hand-split oak lath, each strip uneven and fixed with small forged nails. The original plaster contained horsehair, still visible where the lime had broken cleanly from the wall. Near the chimney she made 3 patches that failed. 1 cracked overnight, 1 sagged, and 1 released from the lath in a single gray sheet. Otis brought an old feed bag from his barn. Inside was horsehair his brother had saved for a repair never begun. Wren washed it, cut it short, and folded it into fresh lime plaster. She pressed a scored scratch coat through the lath until it formed keys behind the wood. Over that, she laid a 3/8-inch brown coat and left it untouched for 72 hours beneath damp cloth. The finished coat went on 1/8 inch thick, drawn smooth with a steel trowel. When the final patch had hardened, she placed her palm against it. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Mayfield owned the Bluegrass Cafe and wore red reading glasses on a chain across her apron. Twice a week, before sunrise, she left a paper bag on Wren's doorstep containing biscuits, hard-boiled eggs, and sometimes a heel of apple cake. Wren caught her there one February morning and tried to press coins into her hand. Doris closed Wren's fingers over them. "You can pay me in candles when the shop reopens." Then she returned to her car without waiting for an answer. Caleb Pritchard arrived on a blue Schwinn with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow as a fence rail, with 1 front tooth chipped diagonally. He split a month's worth of oak behind the studio, stacking each piece bark side up. Wren offered him $2. He shook his head and studied the ground. "My mother said, 'About your grandfather.' That was all." He rode home with the maul across his shoulders. Reverend Boyd walked the lane each morning in a dark wool coat polished at both elbows. He never entered unless invited. He tipped his hat when Wren worked outside and once helped her lift a limestone sill back into place. Before leaving, he rested 2 fingers on the stone. Keep her warm and useful. It was the only prayer he offered. Wren postponed the cellar until February 11th. The wooden door beneath the back stairs had swollen shut, and when it finally opened, air rose from below, smelling of earth, iron, and apples, long gone. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot room with a fieldstone floor. At its center lay a dressed granite slab carved with the same braided circle mark cut into the pond marker. Wren swept around it, measured its edges, and did not try to lift it. Some doors could wait until she understood why they had been made. Under the 3rd step, her broom struck wood. A small oak box had been wedged between the riser and foundation wall. Inside lay a brass key, whose bow formed a perfect Turk's head knot, and a tin type wrapped in linen. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the studio in 1903. She held a strand cutter in one hand and looked directly at the camera. Her brow, narrow chin, and slight turn of the mouth were Wren's own so exactly that Wren touched the image before she could stop herself. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Clara Bell, daughter of founder Amos Bell, age 25, summer of 1903. Wren carried the key upstairs and placed it on the mantel. She tried it in no lock. By spring, she still did not know what had opened. The snow retreated first from the south wall, leaving flattened grass and walnut shells polished by ice. The creek beyond the marsh grew loud with meltwater. By April, green catkins hung from the walnut branches, and the studio windows stood open for an hour each afternoon. Wren cleaned Clara's platinum hook and sharpened the old skiving knife, but she did not begin a full riding crop that spring. The inherited hide was too scarce for haste, and her hands remembered only fragments of Silas's teaching. She chose $1 silver from the cash and spent it on narrow practice strips, beeswax, and a plain fiberglass core. Each evening she made samples no longer than her hand. Some twisted, some showed daylight. She cut them apart and began again. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Wren completed her first riding crop. The core was flexible fiberglass, tapered by hand, and wrapped in linen before the leather touched it. She cut 12 strands from alum-tanned cowhide, beveled every edge, and dressed them with 2 parts tallow to 1 part beeswax. The plait narrowed evenly from handle to keeper without one visible gap. At the grip she tied Adelaide's 7-bite, 5-lid Turk's head, tightening it in 3 careful circuits and leaving it 48 hours before polishing. She tested the crop outside at dawn. The keeper passed through the cold air with 1 clean report that crossed the field and returned faintly from the limestone rise. Wren did not make another that week. She hung the finished crop above the bench and studied it in changing light, marking 2 places where the tension could be improved. By then the studio had become spare and useful. The restored white pine floor held a workbench beneath the north windows. Leather strands hung in orderly shades from cream to dark brown. The blue glass lamp stood beside Adelaide's letter, and the cast-iron wall hook had been cleaned but not polished, its hollow chamber closed with the original cedar disc. The old sign outside still read, Bell and Ellison, though winter had taken more paint from both names. The brass key waited on the mantel until the following summer. Wren found the lock by accident while trimming deadwood from the oldest walnut beside the pond. A patch of bark near the trunk's western side sounded flat under the handle of her pruning saw. Beneath a growth of moss sat a narrow brass plate, darkened nearly green, and fitted into a cavity that the tree had slowly begun to close around. The key's braided bow rested neatly against her thumb. It entered the plate without resistance. Inside the tree was a copper-lined compartment no deeper than her forearm. It held a folded 48-star American flag wrapped in oilcloth and a note written by Clara Bell on June 18, 1918, while her younger brother served with the American Expeditionary Forces in France. Clara wrote that the flag had flown above the studio on the morning he departed. She had lowered it before sunset because she could not bear to watch it snap in the wind over an empty road. Her brother returned in 1919 with a damaged lung and never braided again, but he sat beside the stove for 23 winters, cutting thread and sharpening tools for those who could. The note ended with a single instruction. Do not display this for sorrow. Unfold it when someone comes home. Wren carried the flag inside, but did not hang it. She refolded it along Clara's creases and stored it with Thomas Bell's Purple Heart until the following June. On June 6, 2025, the anniversary of the Normandy landings, she took the medal to Lexington Cemetery. Mrs. Vale helped locate Thomas Bell's memorial inscription among the family records, though his body remained overseas. Wren placed the medal beneath his name for the length of 1 quiet hour, then returned it to its case before rain began. She used only 4 coins from the cash. The first bought her practice leather. The second paid for new cutting blades. The third purchased silver wire for the ferrule on her first commissioned crop. The fourth paid a surveyor to settle the disputed eastern boundary, which proved to run along the creek rather than through the walnut grove. The remaining money stayed wrapped in oil paper. Wren returned it to the tin box with the diagrams, the metal, and a copy of Adelaide's letter. She placed the box inside the cast-iron hook, fitted the cedar disc, and stitched a new smoked leather collar around the seam. On the collar's inner face, where no one could see without removing it, she wrote 3 words in silver pencil. For the next one. The shop reopened without an announcement. Wren pinned an index card to the corkboard inside the Bluegrass Cafe. Hand-braided riding crops repairs. Accepted inquire. At Bell and Ellison, Doris moved the card away from the pie prices and gave it the center position. The first order came from a riding instructor who needed a keeper replaced. The second was for a child's short crop with a narrow grip. Word traveled through barns rather than advertisements. By autumn, more than 40 names filled Wren's mailing list, written in pencil so addresses could be corrected without wasting paper. She accepted only the work she could finish honestly. Caleb returned one Saturday carrying a board wrapped in an army blanket. He had grown broad across the shoulders and now drove a feed truck, though the same chipped tooth showed when he smiled. He had carved the board from black walnut and painted the letters by hand. Bell and Ellison fine crops and braided leather and daughter's wren traced the final words. There are no daughters, she said. Caleb leaned the sign against the bench. Not yet. He refused payment, but accepted coffee and 2 biscuits from a bag Doris had left that morning. Together they removed the old cedar sign and fixed the new one above the door. Wren kept the original inside, behind the counter, where the faded names could remain without facing another winter. That evening, she opened a clean sheet of paper at the workbench. My dear one, whoever you are. She wrote the date, then stopped to sharpen the pencil. She described the repaired roof, the boundary at the creek, and the exact place where she had stored the tin box. She explained that money could preserve a room but could not teach a hand. For that, the next person would need ruined samples, patient correction, and enough humility to cut apart a day's work. She added instructions for the crop hanging above the bench. 12 strands, a linen-wrapped core. The 3rd strand dressed slightly too wet near the handle. She did not hide the flaw. A braid told the truth about every pull. Near midnight, Wren carried the unfinished letter outside. The walnut plate had disappeared beneath new bark, leaving only the faint outline of its corners. At the pond, water moved through reeds where ice had once sealed the surface. The limestone marker stood clean, its braided circle pale beneath the moon. Pain is only a loose strand until patience braids it into strength. She returned to the studio and set the letter beside Adelaide's, leaving room beneath her signature for pages not yet written. Then she extinguished the blue glass lamp and listened as the building settled around the cooling stove. The leather riding crop maker's studio waits. It has always waited. In the county clerk's annex, Eleanor Vale retired the following spring. Before clearing her desk, she lifted the glass and found the worn dollar Wren had paid with, still flattened beside the courthouse photograph. She left it in the drawer for the next clerk, along with a note explaining that some payments should remain exactly where they were received.